Buncombe County Quarterly Report, October 1876. Burnt Creek Home for Destitute Children. Superintendent, Mr. Harold Peck. Children in residence, 43. Deaths this quarter, 2. Fever. Children placed in apprenticeship, 5. Funds received, $387. Funds expended, $291. Surplus, $96. Report filed by Harold Peck, countersigned by County Commissioner James Avery. Pause on that document for a moment. Read it again if you need to. It looks exactly like what it claims to be. A routine quarterly accounting filed by a county functionary, stamped and filed and forgotten in a ledger somewhere in the Buncombe County Courthouse. It has the flat grammar of bureaucracy. It has the comfortable weight of officialdom. It was countersigned, which means someone besides Peck looked at it and said, "Yes, this is correct. This is acceptable. Every number in this report is a lie." But the lie isn't in what it says. It's in what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that the 2 children who died that quarter, a 6-year-old boy named Thomas Rowe and a 4-year-old girl named Pearl Hensley, did not die of fever. They died of malnutrition compounded by a winter in a building with 2 working fireplaces and 43 children. Fever was the diagnosis, because fever was what you wrote when a child's body simply stopped. It didn't require further explanation. It didn't invite further questions. It doesn't say that the 5 children placed in apprenticeship, removed from the institution's care and placed with farms, businesses, and households throughout Buncombe County, were transacted. That Peck received a fee for each placement, that the children received nothing. That apprenticeship, as practiced at Burnt Creek in 1876, meant selling a child's labor for a period of years in exchange for room, board, and the fiction of a trade education. Room and board that the receiving household defined and provided, with no inspection, no follow-up, no recourse. It doesn't say that the surplus, that tidy, almost cheerful $96, was generated by feeding 43 children on a food budget designed for 20, because 23 of those children did not officially exist. They existed in Peck's private ledger, the one that was never submitted to the county. Children whose families paid Peck directly to take them. Children whose per capita state funding Peck collected, while keeping their names off the official rolls. Ghost children, eating ghost rations, while Peck pocketed the difference. The Burnt Creek Home for Destitute Children was not an institution of care. It was a business model wearing the face of charity. And in the autumn of 1876, in a valley outside Asheville, North Carolina, in the hollow of the Blue Ridge, where the creek ran rust-red from iron ore in the banks, and where the sound of children had long since stopped sounding like childhood, a 15-year-old girl named Cora Presley decided she was going to destroy it. Not the building. The building was the least of it. She was going to destroy the business model. She was going to make it visible. What she did to accomplish that was more dangerous than fire. It was more permanent than fire. And it started the way most revolutions start, with a stolen pencil and a scrap of newspaper margin. Cora Presley arrived at Burnt Creek in 1869 when she was 8 years old. She arrived the way most children arrived, through the front door in the company of an adult who was not coming back. Her mother, a woman named Ellen Presley, who had survived the war by doing things she never discussed and who was losing the fight against something in her lungs that the doctors in Asheville called consumption, and that Ellen herself called her punishment, brought Cora to the door on an October morning when the leaves were so bright they looked like they were trying to warn you about something. Ellen had told Cora that this was a school. Cora was 8 and had never been to school and had no reason to believe otherwise. She believed it right up until the moment the door opened and she smelled the place. That particular institutional smell of lye soap and mildew, and something underneath both of those that took Cora years to identify, and that she finally named when she was old enough to have language for it, as the smell of despair metabolized into skin. And she understood, in the way children understand things before they have words for them, that this was not a school. This was a place you were put. Ellen Presley kissed Cora once on the top of her head, turned, and walked down the road toward Asheville. Cora watched her go. She did not cry, because she understood without being told that crying was not going to change the direction Ellen Presley was walking. She turned back to the door, and the woman standing in it, a thin, sharp-featured woman named Mrs. Hobbs, who served as Peck's housekeeper and who had the permanently disappointed expression of a person who had expected more from life and gotten Burnt Creek. And she said, in the steady voice that would serve her for the next 7 years, "Where do I sleep?" That was Cora Presley at 8. By 15, she had become something the institution did not have a category for. She had taught herself to read. This is worth saying slowly, because in 1876, in Buncombe County, North Carolina, in a privately operated children's home, receiving per capita state funds that were largely fictitious, the education of the children in residence was not a priority. It was technically required by the terms of the state funding. The Burnt Creek Charter described, in language so vague as to be meaningless, a commitment to the moral and educational uplift of the children in its care. But Harold Peck's interpretation of this commitment was a Bible reading on Sundays, conducted by whoever happened to be willing to do it, and an annual visit from a Methodist minister named Reverend Clyde Stokes, who shook hands with Peck, admired the building's exterior, shared a meal that bore no resemblance to what the children ate, and filed a letter with the county attesting to the spiritual welfare of the residents. Cora had learned to read from the materials available to her. The Bible, first. She had stolen a hymnal from the chapel and worked through it letter by letter, matching sounds she'd heard to marks on paper, until the marks began to resolve into meaning. Then newspapers, when she could get them. Peck subscribed to the Asheville Citizen and left his copies in the common room after he'd read them, which gave Cora approximately 40 minutes before Mrs. Hobbs collected and burned them. 40 minutes was enough. Cora read the way a person drinks when they've been thirsty a long time, fast, without waste. By the time she was 12, she could read anything placed in front of her. By 13, she could write, having practiced on anything available. The margins of hymnals, the backs of the paper labels that came off supply crates, in the dirt with a stick when nothing else served. Her handwriting was angular and cramped from the conditions in which it was formed, not the careful copper plate of a schoolroom, but something functional and urgent, like writing you do when you're not sure how long you have. At 14, she began the record. She called it, in her own private nomenclature, the account. She started it because of James Hollifield, but she kept it because of everything she began to see once she had started looking with the intention of writing down what she saw. The act of documentation changed her perception. Once she began to record, she could not stop seeing things worth recording. The account became a compulsion, and then a purpose, and finally, though she would not have used this word, a weapon. She kept it hidden in the east wall of the sleeping room, where a stone had worked loose from the foundation and left a gap behind the plaster, just large enough to hold a bundle of papers folded thin. She checked it every morning and every night. She added to it 2 or 3 times a week, in the abbreviated style she had developed to stretch her paper supply. Abbreviations, symbols, shorthand that was entirely her own invention. March 14th, 1876. James was taken today. He cried. Mr. Peck told him to be a man. James is 10. That was the entry she would read to the North Carolina General Assembly in 1920, when her hands were old and the paper was yellow, and the handwriting looked like it had been made by someone else entirely. Some vanished child writing in urgent, cramped letters on the margins of a world that had not been designed to notice her. But that is getting ahead of the story. In 1876, Cora was 15 and James Hollifield was 10, and he was gone. Harold Peck had been superintendent of the Burnt Creek Home for Destitute Children since 1871, when he succeeded a man named Torrance, who had died of apoplexy during an argument with the county about funding. Peck had not sought the position. He had been a clerk in the county commissioner's office, a man in his mid-40s with a careful handwriting and a talent for the kind of arithmetic that made budgets look different from what they were. And when Commissioner Avery had needed someone to take over Burnt Creek without making a fuss, Peck had been available and willing. He was not, to anyone's outward observation, a cruel man. He did not beat children, or rather, he permitted it in the form of what he called discipline, administered by his groundskeeper, a man named Silas Broom. But he did not do it himself, and he kept it within what he considered reasonable limits. He did not take any particular pleasure in the deprivation he oversaw. He did not hate children. He had a general opinion that children should be quiet and useful and grateful, and that the children of the poor were constitutionally inclined to ingratitude and disorder. But this opinion was so thoroughly conventional in Buncombe County in 1876 as to be nearly invisible. The water in which everyone swam. What Peck had discovered in his first year at Burnt Creek was arithmetic. Specifically, the arithmetic of per capita funding applied to an institution where the head count was flexible and the oversight was minimal. The state of North Carolina paid, in 1876, approximately $8.50 per child per quarter to institutions caring for destitute children. This amount had been set in 1868 during Reconstruction, when the federal government was still providing supplementary funding and the state legislature had aspirations. By 1876, the federal money was gone, the aspirations had curdled, and the $8.50 had not been adjusted for anything. $8.50 per child per quarter. Peck had 43 children officially on the rolls, which meant the state sent him approximately $365.50 per quarter from state funds, supplemented by the charitable contributions and local taxes that made up the remainder of the $387. Against this, he was expected to provide housing, food, clothing, medical care, and education. The housing was the building, which Peck owned, and for which he charged the county a lease fee that he also paid to himself. The food was the question. Peck had discovered in his first winter at Burnt Creek that children could be kept alive, could be kept not dead, which was his operational definition of care, on a diet that cost considerably less than the per capita allocation suggested. Cornmeal, salt pork occasionally, dried beans, potatoes when available, buttermilk when the dairy up the road had excess. These were not foods that required much money. They required the willingness to watch children eat them and believe that this constituted provision. Peck was willing. He was practiced at it. He had, as mentioned, a talent for the kind of arithmetic that made budgets look different from what they were. And he had applied this talent to the task of making $291 in quarterly expenditure look like the full and appropriate provisioning of 43 children, when in fact it represented bare subsistence for approximately 20, with the gap made up by what Peck privately thought of as efficiency, and what Cora Presley's account described with precise specificity. October 12th, 1875, the account read, "Supper was cornmeal mush, no salt. Eli would not eat. I fed him from my portion. He has not spoken in 3 days. His hands shake in the morning. I believe he is the same as Thomas was before Thomas died. I have told Mrs. Hobbs. Mrs. Hobbs told me to mind my concerns. Eli was 5 years old. He had arrived at Burnt Creek 6 months earlier, in a state that Cora recognized as the particular blankness that came after something had happened to a child that the child had no framework to process. He did not speak. He responded to his name sometimes, and sometimes did not. He ate when food was placed in front of him, and did not eat when it was not, without apparent distress either way, as though the mechanisms that signaled hunger and satiety had been disconnected from the systems that would act on them. Cora had appointed herself his guardian from the first week of his arrival, with no ceremony and no discussion. She simply began making sure he ate, making sure he was warm, placing herself between him and anything that seemed likely to cause him additional harm. She did not know what had happened to Eli before Burnt Creek, and she never found out. His intake papers, filed in Peck's office, listed him as Eli, surname unknown, age approximately 5, parents unknown, delivered by a man described as a neighbor. The neighbor's name was not recorded. The man had not provided it, and Peck had not asked, because Peck was receiving a private per capita payment for Eli that did not appear in the county records, and the fewer questions attached to that transaction, the better. This was the ghost child system. Peck maintained 2 sets of books. The official record, the one submitted to Commissioner Avery, the one that generated the quarterly report, showed 43 children. The private record showed the full count, which fluctuated between 48 and 52, depending on the season and the particular currents of misfortune that brought children to his door. For the children who appeared only in the private record, Peck collected fees from the families or individuals who delivered them, fees that ranged from $2 to $5 per quarter, paid in cash, not entered anywhere. These children ate the same food as the official children. They slept in the same beds. They wore the same inadequate clothing. They were, in every practical sense, indistinguishable from their officially recognized counterparts. The only difference was that their existence was invisible to the county, and therefore to any possible oversight. Cora knew about the ghost children. She had counted them herself, carefully and repeatedly, and compared her count to the county reports she had read in the newspapers. The discrepancy was consistent. She recorded it. January 3rd, 1876. Official count per. The Citizen newspaper report is 43. I count 51 this morning at breakfast. The 8 who are not counted. Eli. The Garland boys, 2 of them brothers, came in November. The girl with the scar on her neck. Nobody has told me her name. The Hensley baby, who is sick. 2 boys whose names I don't know yet. They are all real. They all need to be counted. Peck ate breakfast every morning at a table in his private dining room, a small space off the kitchen that was separated from the children's eating area by a wall and a door that was always closed. His breakfast was eggs, generally, and cornbread, and coffee that came from Asheville. And in the winter months, a glass of apple brandy that he poured from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer, and that he considered medicinal. He was not a dramatic drinker. He drank the way he did everything, with the moderation of a man who was careful about the impression he made. But the breakfast was good, and it was warm, and it was eaten in a room that had its own fireplace, and it was completely separated by wall and door and the mechanism of his own deliberate inattention from the room in which 43 officially counted children ate cornmeal mush without salt. He told himself every morning at that table that he was providing a service. He told himself this often enough, and in enough different formulations, that it had ceased to feel like justification and had become simply his understanding of reality. Before Burnt Creek, these children had nothing. They had destitute parents or dead parents, or parents who were in one of the ways that Reconstruction-era poverty manifested: dispersed, desperate, destroyed. They had been delivered to his door by the county, by the state, by private individuals, by desperation in its many forms. He had given them a roof. He had given them food sufficient to sustain life. He had given them the minimal social organization of an institution, which was more structure than they would have had in the streets of Asheville or in the broken households they came from. He genuinely believed this. This is what made him more frightening than a sadist. A sadist can be identified and removed. A man who genuinely believes that survival constitutes adequate care, who has organized an entire institutional logic around the proposition that not dead equals cared for, is a man who will defend what he is doing with the full conviction of someone who believes he is doing right. Peck was not haunted. He slept well. He noted, in his private moments, that the mortality rate at Burnt Creek was lower than the mortality rate among destitute children on the streets of Asheville, which was true, and which he took as evidence that his methods were sound. He did not calculate the mortality rate against children in functioning households. He did not ask what the children at Burnt Creek might have become if they had been adequately fed, adequately housed, adequately educated, adequately loved. These were not questions he considered relevant. He had calibrated his ambition to the lowest plausible threshold. Are they alive? And found it consistently met. And this was, to him, success. The quarterly report went to Commissioner Avery's office by courier. Avery signed it without reading it beyond the first page. He was not a bad man either. He was a man with 17 things on his desk that each needed attention before the end of the week, and the Burnt Creek report was the 17th of these things, and it had never before given him reason to read it carefully. And the human tendency to avoid allocating attention to things that have not yet required attention is one of the most powerful forces in institutional life. He signed it. He sent it back. The $387 was disbursed. The machine continued. Cora watched all of this from inside it. She watched the way you watch things when you have no power to change them through direct action, with a precise, cataloging attention, looking for the lever, looking for the angle, looking for the version of events that could be communicated to someone outside the machine in a way that would make them understand what the inside looked like. She had tried twice to get the account out before Anna Garrett arrived. The first attempt was in the spring of 1876, when a minister came through Burnt Creek, not Reverend Stokes, who was Peck's regular chaplain and entirely in his pocket, but a traveling minister from somewhere in Tennessee who had connections to the Methodist circuit and who seemed, to Cora's careful observation, genuinely interested in the children. She had watched him for an entire day before approaching him. She noted that he spoke to the children directly rather than about them. He kneeled to be at eye level with Eli, which no adult had done before in Cora's observation except herself. He asked children their names and waited for the answers. These were signs. Cora had developed a taxonomy of adult behavior, having spent 7 years observing it with nothing to do but observe, and the signs suggested someone who might be trusted with something fragile. She had folded a copy of the most recent account entries, 14 pages, both sides, in her cramped and abbreviated hand, into the cover of a hymnal and pressed it into the minister's hands during the Sunday service, while Peck was distracted by a conversation with Mrs. Hobbs. She said quietly, without meeting his eyes, because meeting his eyes would have been noticed. Please read this when you are away from here, and then please take it to the newspaper in Asheville or to the county judge, and please don't tell Mr. Peck. The minister, whose name was Reverend Albemarle Foster, took the hymnal. He smiled at her. He left that afternoon. He was, as it turned out, a friend of Peck's from before, from a time when both men had been involved in the same church committee in Asheville, and he went directly from Burnt Creek to Peck's boarding house and told him what the girl had handed him and gave him the hymnal. Peck came back to Burnt Creek the following morning and conducted what he called an inventory of the children's personal effects, which was a search, and he found nothing. Cora had a duplicate of the account in the wall and had guessed, with the instinct of someone who has survived by reading situations correctly, that her trust had been misplaced and had made sure there was nothing to find. But she watched Peck's face during the search, and she understood with absolute clarity that the minister had told him. She adjusted her taxonomy accordingly. Church connections were not sufficient evidence of trustworthiness. Proximity to Peck was disqualifying. She needed someone with no prior relationship with Harold Peck. The second attempt was more circuitous and failed in a different way. In September of 1876, a girl named Martha Capps, 13 years old, placed with a family in Asheville proper, a merchant family named Whitfield, who seemed, by the reports Martha gave Cora in the weeks before her placement, like decent people, left Burnt Creek with a letter sewn into the hem of her dress. The letter was addressed to the editor of the Asheville Citizen and described in Cora's precise and abbreviated language the essential structure of Peck's accounting fraud and the conditions inside the institution. Cora had coached Martha on what to do. "Wait until you are settled with the Whitfields," she said. "Wait a week. Then give the letter to Mrs. Whitfield and tell her what it says and ask her to deliver it." Martha waited a week. She gave the letter to Mrs. Whitfield. Mrs. Whitfield read it. She was a literate woman, a quality not universal in Buncombe County in 1876, and she read the letter carefully. And then she folded it and put it in her bureau drawer and did not speak of it again. Cora did not know this for several weeks, because Martha was her only contact outside Burnt Creek, and Martha's letters were written to Cora through the institution's mail, which Peck reviewed. It was only through a carefully worded exchange of what appeared to be ordinary correspondence, full of coded references that Cora and Martha had established before the placement, that Cora eventually understood. Mrs. Whitfield had made a calculation. The calculation was this: if the orphanage was reported and investigated and found to be as the letter described, one of two things would happen. Either it would be reformed, which would require political will that she had no confidence the county possessed, or it would be closed, which meant 43 children, officially 43, would be returned to their families or dispersed into the streets or distributed to other institutions that might be worse. The Whitfield family had Martha now. Martha was eating well and sleeping warm and learning the Whitfield household's rhythms. Mrs. Whitfield had begun to feel something for her that she was not yet prepared to call maternal, but that was in that direction. She was not going to disturb this arrangement by introducing an orphanage scandal into her husband's social world. She was not cruel. She was not indifferent. She had made a calculation, and the calculation had come down on the side of Martha's immediate welfare rather than the welfare of the 42 children still at Burnt Creek. Cora understood this when she worked it out from Martha's letters, and she did not blame Mrs. Whitfield because she understood the calculation, even if she would have made it differently. But she filed it in her taxonomy. People with something to lose will protect what they have before they will act on what they know. She needed someone with less to lose, or someone whose social position made action easier than inaction. She had not yet found that person when January of 1877 arrived, and with it, Miss Anna Garrett. The announcement of the new teacher had come to Cora secondhand through the back-channel information network that the children at Burnt Creek maintained with the particular efficiency of people who have nothing else to trade. News traveled through the institution in its own way, whispered in the sleeping rooms, passed in the work lines, communicated in the shorthand of sideways glances and brief contact, and the news that Peck had hired a teacher from the female academy in Asheville had made its way to Cora 3 days before Anna Garrett arrived. Cora's first response was caution. She had noted that her last 2 attempts to communicate outside had failed through the vectors of church and civic connection, and that each failure had cost her something, either direct exposure or the loss of a potential ally. She was rationing her attempts. She could not afford a third failure that was traceable back to her, because Peck, for all his obtuseness in some areas, had begun to watch her more carefully than he watched the other children, with the particular attention of a man who suspects someone of knowing something and has not been able to confirm what they know. She filed the teacher as a possibility and began, with the patience that was one of her most essential qualities, to observe. Anna Garrett arrived on a Tuesday in January 1877 in a hired buggy from Asheville with a trunk of books and a coat that was too thin for the valley's cold. She was 24 years old, a graduate of the Asheville Female Academy, the youngest daughter of a watchmaker who had moved to Asheville from Virginia before the war, and who had given his daughters what education he could afford, which was more than most. She had applied for the Burnt Creek position because the Female Academy's placement office had listed it, and because she wanted to teach, and because she had, at 24, a precise and detailed picture of what teaching meant that was constructed almost entirely from books, and almost not at all from the experience of being inside an institution that existed primarily as an accounting mechanism. She was not naive in the way that means foolish. She was naive in the way that means unacquainted with a particular kind of knowledge. The knowledge of what institutions become when they are created to serve the vulnerable and funded to serve themselves instead. She had read about poor law reform and the abuses of the workhouse system in England, had read about the Children's Aid Society in New York, and Charles Loring Brace's arguments about the dangers of institutional childcare, and had formed the view, common among educated reformers of her generation, that institutions were preferable to nothing but dangerous without oversight. She had applied to Burnt Creek with the intention of providing exactly this kind of oversight, a responsible, educated presence inside the institution. She had not considered, when forming this intention, that the superintendent would manage her perception of the institution as carefully as he managed everything else. Harold Peck was, in Cora's taxonomy, extremely competent at the maintenance of appearances for intermittent visitors. He had, over 5 years, developed a precise repertoire of institutional performance. The clean front rooms, the scrubbed children produced on schedule, the Sunday inspection of dormitories that were temporarily organized, the meals that happened to be somewhat more substantial on the days when observers were present. He extended this performance to Anna Garrett's first weeks at Burnt Creek, and it worked because Anna didn't yet know what she was looking for. The schoolroom was the converted front parlor of the main building, a room that had been a parlor when Burnt Creek was a private house, and that retained something of its original function in its dimensions and its front-facing windows, through which the light came in good in the mornings, and which had, when Anna arrived, the look of a room that had been cleaned specifically for her arrival. She would not know for several weeks that it was cleaned again only when Peck expected a visitor. She had 17 children in her first class. Peck had assigned her the older children, 7 through 14, theoretically, because the younger children were kept in a separate room, under the supervision of Mrs. Hobbs, who did not consider education within her responsibilities, and who maintained order through the reliable methods of silence requirements and corner standing, neither of which required any particular curriculum. Anna's 17 included children at widely different points of literacy, from those who could not read at all to Cora, who read better than most adults Anna had taught to, and Anna spent her first week making the assessments that would allow her to construct a teaching approach suited to the range. She noticed Cora immediately. It was hard not to. Cora sat in the back row and read every book Anna assigned in the first day, and returned them the second day with specific questions about specific passages that Anna had not anticipated from a child who had described her education on the intake form as none. She asked Anna about the histories she had brought, not the children's primers, but the actual history texts, the ones Anna had packed out of her own bookshelf. With the directness of someone who is accustomed to learning everything herself and has no template for the social modulations of being taught, she did not raise her hand. She did not frame her questions as politely as the social conventions of a formal school would have required. She simply asked, "What happened in the end? What is this word? Why does it say this when it means that?" Anna found her extraordinary. She also found her frightening, in the way that extremely self-contained people who have survived through their own resources are sometimes frightening to people who have lived inside the protection of ordinary social structures. There was something in Cora's eyes that Anna could not name. Not unkindness exactly, but an assessment, a calibration, a measuring of everyone around her against some private rubric that Anna could sense without understanding. What Cora saw in those first weeks was the standard array of performative indicators. Anna was well dressed for her circumstances, careful about it, which suggested social consciousness and a desire to maintain standards even in reduced conditions. She brought her own books, which suggested real investment in the work rather than mere employment. She remembered children's names after one meeting, which was rare. She did not report immediately to Peck after difficult classroom events, which was either independence or naivety, and Cora had not yet determined which. She looked at the food at lunch on her third day with an expression that she controlled very quickly, but that Cora saw a flicker of something that might have been dismay, suppressed with the efficiency of someone who had been taught that certain responses were inappropriate in professional settings. That dismay was the first entry on Cora's mental account of Anna Garrett. Someone who felt something at the food was someone who was still capable of feeling something about the situation. She gave it 7 more weeks before she moved. In the meantime, the business of Burnt Creek continued in its regular operations, and to understand what Cora was protecting the children from, to understand the full weight of what she was documenting, it is necessary to follow that business into its most distant extension, into the county roads and farm fields and the tannery on the French Broad River, where a 10-year-old boy named James Hollifield was learning what apprenticeship really meant. James had arrived at Burnt Creek 2 years earlier, in the winter of 1874, at the age of 8. His parents were not dead. This was a detail that Cora had noted in the account with particular significance, because the official intake document described James as an orphan, which he was not. His father was alive and working a farm in Madison County. His mother was alive and living with the father. They had 4 other children. They had had a bad winter, and James was the oldest, and some county agent or church official or just a neighbor who knew about Burnt Creek and knew that it took children, had suggested that if you couldn't feed them all, the county home would keep one alive until you could take him back. The father had brought James in February. He had said he would be back in the spring. He had not come back in the spring, or the spring after, or the spring after that. James understood, by the time Cora first entered him in the account, that he was not going to be retrieved. He had stopped looking for his father at the gate every morning, which was something Cora had watched happen. The gradual extinction of a daily expectation. with the kind of controlled attention that kept the sadness of it from immobilizing her. She did not look away from sad things. Looking away was the luxury of people with somewhere else to look. She recorded them. November 14th, 1874. James Hollifield came this month. 8 years old, from Madison County. His father left him. He waits at the gate after breakfast every day. I haven't told him to stop. January 2nd, 1875. James stopped going to the gate. This economy of language, this compression of an enormous grief into 2 short sentences separated by 6 weeks, was characteristic of Cora's accounting style. She did not elaborate on what it meant that James had stopped going to the gate. She did not need to. The gap between the 2 sentences contained everything. By March of 1876, James was 10 and had been at Burnt Creek for 2 years. He was a compact, serious boy who had developed, as many of the children did, a specific competence that made him useful to the institution. In James's case, this was a facility with animals. He had grown up on a farm, and he knew how animals moved and what they needed. And he took care of the 2 mules that Peck kept for the farm work and the wagon, and the chickens that lived in the yard, and that he managed with a patience and a gentleness that were, in the context of Burnt Creek, remarkable. Peck noticed the animal facility. Peck also received, in late February 1876, a letter from a man named Caulfield, who operated a tannery on the French Broad River outside Asheville, and who needed a boy. Not a grown worker, a boy. Boys were useful at a tannery for specific tasks that required smallness, climbing into the vats, to scrub, working in the low spaces under the drying racks, hauling the raw hides that came in from the slaughterhouses because the hides could be dropped into a barrow pulled by someone short enough to maneuver between the vat stands. Caulfield paid Peck $3 for the placement. He would pay no wages to James. He would provide board, a cot in the back of the tannery, food from the workers' table, a blanket in winter. He would provide no education. The letter described this arrangement in the flat language of a business proposition, because that is what it was. Peck signed the agreement on March 10th. He told James on March 13th in the same flat language, "You're going to learn a trade. This is an opportunity that many boys in your situation would be grateful for. You will have work and food and a place to sleep." March 14th, 1876. James was taken today. He cried. Mr. Peck told him to be a man. James is 10. James Hollifield arrived at the Caulfield Tannery on the afternoon of March 14th, 1876, in the back of the county wagon that made the circuit of placement deliveries and pickups. He had never smelled anything like a tannery. The smell was the first assault, the deep, caustic, animal smell of hides in various stages of processing, the bark liquor in the vats, the fat and blood of the raw materials, the ammonia of the urine that some tanneries still used in the early stages. He stood in the yard and took in the smell and the sound and the scale of the operation. Caulfield's was not large by industrial standards, but it was enormous by the standards of James's experience, and he did not cry again because Peck's instruction had landed somewhere in him with the weight of a prohibition. He worked 14 hours the first day. This was not unusual. The tannery workers worked long days because the hides did not pause in their processing for human convenience, and because Caulfield ran a competitive operation and competition in the tanning business in 1876 meant labor cost minimization. James's specific tasks were the vat cleaning and the barrow hauling and the hair scraping when the hides came in fresh, and he did them because there was nothing else to do, and because the men around him did them, and because the alternative to doing them, as far as he could see, was worse than doing them. He slept on the cot in the back of the tannery and ate at the workers' table, and did not speak much, and did not cry again, because at 10 years old, he had already been through enough transitions to understand the practical futility of crying after the fact. The crying was for before, when there was still a possibility of changing the outcome. After the outcome was established, the crying served nothing, and he had no surplus energy for things that served nothing. Cora did not know all of this in real time. She knew James was gone. She knew where he had gone, because she had heard Peck mention the tannery when he thought she was out of earshot. She had no way to contact James, no mechanism by which information from inside the tannery could be transmitted back to her. She maintained the entry in the account and added to it what she was able to confirm from the occasional piece of gossip that made its way into the institution. Through the delivery men and the few visitors who passed through. What she knew by the spring of 1876 was this: the tannery placements were not education. They were labor extraction. The county's binding out statute, which Peck cited in every placement agreement as the legal authority for his actions, was intended to provide orphaned children with trade education through supervised apprenticeship to a skilled craftsman, who was required by the statute to teach the child the trade, and to provide for their moral and educational instruction. This requirement was entirely unenforced. Caulfield was not required to provide any documentation of instruction. No county agent visited the tannery to confirm that James was being taught anything beyond the brute mechanics of the work. The distinction between apprenticeship and child labor was, in Buncombe County in 1876, entirely theoretical. Peck received his $3 per quarter for James's placement, recorded it in the private ledger, and did not think about James Hollifield again, unless something happened that required him to. The girls placed out went primarily to domestic service. Sadie Buchanan, 7 years old, was placed in the early fall of 1875 with a family named Doss, who farmed land north of Asheville, in the area where the creek ran through a cove, and the family had been there for 3 generations and had the self-sufficiency and the particular rigidity of people who have been doing things the same way for a long time and have no interest in doing them differently. Sadie's placement was not unusual in its conditions. She was expected to work. She was expected to be useful. And she was not expected to be educated beyond the household skills she would acquire by doing them. But the Doss family was not intentionally cruel, and Sadie ate regular meals and slept in a proper bed and was not beaten. And this represented, by the practical metrics of Burnt Creek, an improvement in her circumstances. Cora knew this about Sadie's placement because Sadie was old enough when she left to take a letter. Not the account, which was too valuable to risk, but a brief note sewn into her collar with instructions for how to make contact. Sadie's contact had been irregular and was mediated by the Doss family's willingness to allow her to send mail, which they permitted on the grounds that it seemed harmless, and that Mrs. Doss had a general sympathy for the child's situation. The letters that came back were written in the simple, careful handwriting of a child learning to write. Mrs. Doss had sent Sadie to the local school, which Cora noted with a specific and careful relief because schooling meant literacy, and literacy meant Sadie's future options were not entirely defined by service. Not all the placements were like Sadie's. Cora tracked what she could. September 1875, Ruth, age 9, placed with the Whitmore family in Weaverville. No letter. Cannot confirm condition. October 1875, the Henderson boy, about 12, placed at the Garrison Mill. Delivery man says he saw him there in December. He was working. No other report. March 1876. James to the Caulfield Tannery. No contact possible. April 1876. Clara Moss, 11. Placed with a widow named Sayers. Letter came in June. She says she is treated well. Mrs. Sayers has no children and is teaching her to sew. She says she is happy. I believe her. June 1876. The boys called Baker, both of them, 8 and 6, placed together with a farm family. Nobody told me where. Peck did not say the county or the name. The account accumulated. Cora kept it in the wall and added to it, and was careful, careful, careful. Not because she was afraid for herself, precisely, but because she was afraid for what would happen to the account if she was discovered. The account was the most important thing at Burnt Creek. The account was the record that the institution could not produce for itself, because the institution's purpose was to produce a different record. The clean, flat, lying, quarterly report. The account was the counter-document, the anti-report, the evidence of what happened in the gap between the official version and the actual version. She had given it 7 years of her life, nearly half the years she'd been alive, and she was not going to lose it to a search by Silas Broom because she had made a mistake about someone's trustworthiness. She watched Anna Garrett for 7 more weeks after the teacher's arrival. She watched her with the same systematic attention she applied to everything, noting the reactions, noting the inconsistencies between official Burnt Creek and the reality Anna was beginning, slowly, to perceive. She noted the day Anna asked Peck about the food budget, and Peck gave her a number that Cora, from her stolen newspaper arithmetic, knew was fabricated. She noted the expression on Anna's face, not quite believing the number, but not yet prepared to challenge it, not yet equipped with the evidence to say, "This is not right." She was getting closer to that edge, but she needed someone to show her the ground below it. Cora chose the morning of February 19th, 1877. She had reasons for the specific date. Peck was in Asheville for the day. Mrs. Hobbs was occupied with a delivery dispute at the back of the building, and the schoolroom was empty in the hour before the morning session, while Anna prepared her materials. Cora walked in, carrying the hymnal with the account folded inside it, and set it on Anna Garrett's desk, and said without preamble, "I need you to read this. Don't say anything to Mr. Peck. Don't say anything to anyone until you've read all of it. Don't try to help me without talking to me first. And when you're done reading, if you want to talk to me, I'll be here." Then she sat down in her chair and opened her own book and waited. Anna Garrett looked at the hymnal. She looked at Cora. She opened it. She read for the full hour before the other children arrived. She read with the expression of someone encountering something that does not fit the category they have prepared for it. Not outrage, not immediately, but something more disorienting. The sensation of a reality rearranging itself. She had been at Burnt Creek for 7 weeks. She had formed an opinion of it. The opinion was being revised, entry by entry, in a child's cramped handwriting, on the margins of newspaper and the blank backs of supply crate labels, and the revision was not comfortable. When the other children arrived, she put the hymnal in her bag and taught the morning session, and did not look at Cora any differently than she looked at the others, which Cora noted with approval. She was good at the adjustment. She had the social facility that comes from formal education and a professional identity, and she used it to maintain the surface of the morning, while underneath the surface, something was shifting. At noon, when the children went to eat, Cora stayed behind on the pretext of returning a book. Anna said, "How long have you been keeping this?" "Since I was 14, Cora said. "Before that in my head." She said, "How do you know these numbers are right?" "I took them from the county reports in the newspaper," Cora said. "Peck's reports. I compared them to what I count here every day. The difference is always between 8 and 12 children." She said, "The placements. The children who were sent out. Do you know where they are?" "Some of them," Cora said. "I'll show you what I have." Anna sat down in the chair behind her desk and looked at Cora across the table and said, "If I take this to someone, to the paper, or to the commissioner, or to anyone, what happens to you?" Cora said, "I don't know." She said, "What happens to the other children?" "I don't know that either," Cora said. "I know what happens to them if nothing changes." Anna Garrett was quiet for a long time. The schoolroom had 3 windows facing south, and the February light came in flat and cold and lit the dust in the air between them with the particular impermanence of winter light in the mountains. That quality of illumination that is present and then gone, and does not promise to come back. She was 24 years old. She had been a teacher for 7 weeks. She was being asked by a 15-year-old girl to participate in the dismantling of the institution in which she worked, using records the girl had kept in secret over a period of years, at unknown personal risk, for the purpose of what? Justice. If justice existed in Buncombe County in 1877, in any form that applied to the children at Burnt Creek. Accountability. If accountability was a concept that had ever been applied to Harold Peck. She did not say yes that day. She said, "Let me think." Cora said, "All right," she said. "Don't do anything yet. Don't tell anyone I showed you." "I understand," Anna said. Cora took the hymnal and left. Anna Garrett thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it while teaching the morning sessions and the afternoon reading hours, while eating her meals at the table Peck had set for her in the room adjacent to his dining room. The room that was not quite as good as Peck's room, but considerably better than the children's room, a distinction she had not examined until now. While lying in the narrow bed in the room Peck had given her in the back of the main building, which was cold, but not the kind of cold the sleeping room for the children was cold. A distinction she had not examined until now either. She examined them now. She examined everything now. The examination was painful, in the way that seeing something for the first time is painful when you understand that the only reason you hadn't seen it before was that you hadn't looked. She had not looked because she had not known to look. Now she knew, and she could not unlook. And the question was what to do with what she saw. She thought about the dilemma she had identified in her first reading of the account, and that grew more pressing the more she considered it. If she reported what she knew, and the orphanage was investigated and found to be fraudulent, the most likely outcome was closure. Closure meant 43 official children, and however many ghost children currently in residence, distributed to other options, and she had spent 3 days trying to identify what those other options were, and finding them limited. Families who had surrendered these children, many of them, were not in a position to take them back. Other institutions in the county were either similarly compromised or already at capacity. The streets of Asheville were not abstract. The children she saw every day in that schoolroom were not abstractions. She thought about the minister who had taken Cora's first record back to Peck. She thought about Mrs. Whitfield's letter, which Cora had described to her, which had been read and filed and not acted on. She thought about the category of person who would receive this account and act on it effectively and quickly, before the political gravity that surrounded any challenge to the existing order could close back over the effort. On the morning of the 4th day, she went back to Cora and said, "There's a newspaper editor in Asheville named Pack, George Pack. He runs the Citizen. He published a piece last year about the condition of the county poorhouse, which means he has already done this once and survived the political consequences. He has a relationship with the progressive faction of the Republican Party, which still has some influence in the county even after Reconstruction. If anyone in Asheville will print this, it's him." Cora looked at her steadily and said, "Have you met him?" "No," Anna said, "but I know people who have." She said, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to come with me," Anna said. "I want you to tell him what you told me. I want your record. I want..." She stopped. She said more quietly, "I want someone who can't be ignored. You can be ignored. I probably can be ignored. But your record, in your handwriting, with your specific numbers, compared directly to the county reports. That's something different." Cora was quiet for a moment. She said, "If Pack prints it and it's traced back to me, Peck will know I kept the account. He already suspects I kept something from the search in the spring. If he knows for certain..." Anna said, "I know." Cora said, "What about the other children? While we go to Asheville, while whatever happens, happens." Anna said, "I've thought about that. I think if we're careful about timing..." She outlined the plan she had spent 3 days constructing. It was careful and detailed, and showed, under the idealism that had brought her to Burnt Creek, a practical intelligence that Cora had suspected but not confirmed. The plan had contingencies. It had timing. It had a provision for what Cora should do if Peck discovered the effort before it reached publication. When Anna finished, Cora was quiet for a long time. She said, "I want you to understand something. I have tried this twice. Both times it failed, and the account was almost lost. If this fails the same way..." "I know," Anna said. She said, "You don't know. You haven't been here long enough to know what it costs when it fails. I'm going to tell you what it costs. Then you can tell me if you still want to do this." She told her. She told her about the minister and the hymnal and the search by Silas Broom. She told her about Martha Capps and the letter in the hem and Mrs. Whitfield's bureau drawer. She told her about Thomas Rowe, 6 years old, dead of malnutrition reported as fever, because the record was not complete unless Thomas Rowe was in it. She told her about Pearl Hensley, 4 years old, same cause, same report, same erasure. She told her about Eli, 5 years old, still alive, who did not speak and whose hands shook in the morning, and who she had been keeping alive for the better part of a year through the brute force of her own vigilance and the donation of portions of her own food, which was already inadequate. She told her all of it in the flat, precise language of the account, because the flat language was more powerful than any other register she had available. She did not cry. She had not cried at Burnt Creek since she was 9 years old. She did not have a position on whether this was strength or damage. Anna Garrett listened to all of it without interrupting. When Cora finished, Anna's face had the expression of someone who has been standing outside a burning building and has just understood the extent of the fire. She said, "I'm still here." Cora said, "All right." She retrieved the account from the wall. She laid it on the table between them. 14 pages, both sides, in the cramped, angular handwriting of a child who had taught herself to write because writing was the only form of power available to her, stretched over 3 years of careful, dangerous, systematic observation. She smoothed it flat with both hands and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Anna and said, "We go on Saturday. Peck is in Asheville Saturdays. We have 4 hours. George Peck was not a tall man and did not have the physical presence that his reputation, such as it was, in the small progressive enclave of Asheville's newspaper community, might have suggested. He was compact and gray-haired and had the permanent slight squint of a man who has spent many years reading type in inadequate light, and his office at the Asheville Citizen was on the second floor of a building on Pack Square. He had no relation to the square, though people often assumed one, and was cluttered in the specific way of newspaper offices of the era, stacked with exchanges and galleys and the detritus of a working press that never entirely settled between editions. He received Anna Garrett on a Saturday in March of 1877, with the professional courtesy of a man accustomed to receiving people who came to him with information. And he looked at Cora, who had come with Anna in a borrowed wagon from a farm a mile down the road from Burnt Creek without Peck's knowledge, on the strength of Anna's told a friend a partial truth about a family errand, with the particular attention of a man who has learned to notice what is in the room before deciding how to respond to what he is told. He let Anna explain the situation. He did not interrupt. He asked 2 questions. Who is your source, and where is the documentation? Anna gestured to Cora. Cora placed the account on his desk. He read it the way Cora had watched him handle everything she'd seen him touch, with the efficient, lateral attention of a reader who is simultaneously absorbing content and evaluating its usability, its legal exposure, its corroborating potential. He read for a long time. He set it down and looked at Cora. He said, "How old are you?" 15, Cora said. He said, "How long have you been at Burnt Creek?" 7 years, she said. "I came in 1869. He said, "The count discrepancy, the children not on official rolls. How certain are you of those numbers?" "I counted every morning at breakfast for 3 years, Cora said. "The number in Peck's quarterly report, in the Citizen last October, said 43. My count that week was 51. My count the week before was 50. My count the week after was 52. He said, "You read the quarterly reports in the paper." "Every quarter," she said. "I compared them to my counts. The discrepancy is consistent. 8 to 12 children unaccounted for in every report I've read." He looked at Anna. He said, "And you can corroborate her account from your own observation." Some of it, Anna said. I've only been there 7 weeks. I can corroborate the food budget. Peck gave me a number that doesn't match what I see being served. I can corroborate the dormitory conditions. I can corroborate that the schoolroom was cleaned before my arrival and has not been cleaned since. He said, the deaths. Pearl Hensley and Thomas Rowe. I can't corroborate those directly, Anna said. But the record... She looked at Cora. Her description of their conditions is consistent with malnutrition, not fever. Pack was quiet for a moment. He looked at the account. He looked at the ceiling. He said, if I print this, Peck will deny it. Avery will defend him. The county will investigate itself and find nothing. That's the usual arc. He said, what I can do is print the numbers. Her numbers against the county numbers. The arithmetic is the story. If the arithmetic is accurate, it is, Cora said. He said, then the arithmetic will make the denial very uncomfortable. The arithmetic and the fact that she's 15 and has been keeping these records since she was 14. The arithmetic and the names. He paused. The names are important. Thomas Rowe, Pearl Hensley, James Hollifield. These are not numbers in a report. These are children. Cora looked at him. She said, are you going to print it? Pack looked back at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is deciding something and has already decided it. He said, yes. He said, I need a week to verify what I can verify. I need to pull the county reports and do the arithmetic myself. I need to confirm that Caulfield's tannery took a boy in March 1876 and that he's still there. I need a legal reading on the binding out statute. Cora said, you can't contact Peck. He said, I won't contact Peck until the day before publication, which is the journalistic convention. He'll have 12 hours to respond. He won't be able to do anything in 12 hours. She said, if he figures out it came from me before the paper is printed. I know, he said. He looked at Anna. Get her back. Don't let this take longer than you planned. He looked at Cora. Is there anyone inside that building who can protect you if this goes wrong before Saturday? Cora thought about this. She thought about the children, about Eli, who could not protect her, and whom she could not leave. About the other children who depended on the equilibrium she maintained through her careful invisibility. She thought about Anna, whose presence at Burnt Creek was its own complication. She said, I've been protecting myself for 7 years. I can manage another week. Pack looked at her for a long moment. He said, I believe you. The drive back to Burnt Creek was silent most of the way. Anna handled the horse with the focused attention of someone who is not entirely comfortable driving and is using the technical task to manage the emotion of the last 2 hours. Cora sat beside her and looked at the road ahead and thought about the week between now and publication and what could go wrong in it and what the plan was for each version of wrong. She said, eventually, what do you think happens after? Anna said, I think Peck is removed. She said, and then? Anna was quiet for a moment. She said, I don't know. I think there's an investigation. I think the county has to do something visible or it looks worse than the original story. Cora said, that's not the same as the children being safe. No, Anna said. It's not. She said, some of them might go back to families that sent them away. Some, Anna said, some of those families will be glad to have them back. Some won't. Cora said, and the ones with no families, the real orphans. Anna said, I'll stay. Whatever happens, I'll stay as long as there's a place to stay, and I'll make noise if they try to close it without providing something better. This was not a guarantee. They both knew it was not a guarantee. The week ahead was not a guarantee of anything. The article, if it ran, was not a guarantee of justice in any form that Cora would have recognized as the thing that Thomas Rowe and Pearl Hensley deserved. It was the best available option in a landscape of inadequate options. It was the lever, positioned at the only available fulcrum, pressed with the only available force. Cora said, "All right." The wagon turned into the valley road toward Burnt Creek. The building came into view at the end of the road. 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, the front porch with the broken rail that had been broken since before Cora arrived. The yard where the children were allowed an hour of outside time in the afternoon, and where the grass had been worn bare along the fence line by the same walking path the children had worn for years. The east wall where, behind the second stone, in from the corner of the foundation, behind the plaster, the wall was now almost empty. Cora looked at the building. She had looked at this building every day for 7 years and had trained herself not to feel anything about it that would be visible on her face. She looked at it now and felt something she could not entirely name. Not hope, which she had learned not to rely on. Not triumph, which was not yet earned, but something in the range of both of them, tempered by the knowledge that the range between now and anything better was still full of things that could go wrong. She got down from the wagon and walked through the front door and went to check on Eli. The week passed. Cora documented it in the account, the way she documented everything, not with drama, but with the precise notation of someone who understands that the present moment is always in the process of becoming evidence. Monday, March 5th, 1877. Nothing unusual. Peck in his office most of the day, brought his accounts out to review, which he does at the start of the month. Mrs. Hobbs, sick with something, kept to her room. Eli ate at supper without prompting. This is the 2nd day in a row. I believe this is improvement. Tuesday, March 6th, school as usual. Miss Garrett taught from the history book. Peck came in to observe for 20 minutes, which he does occasionally. He watched me more than the others. I did not look at him. He left before noon. I do not believe he knows yet. Wednesday, March 7th. Silas Broom asked me this morning what Miss Garrett and I were talking about at noon yesterday. I said she was explaining a problem in arithmetic. He looked at me for a long time. I looked back. He went away. He tells Peck things. I don't know what he heard. Thursday, March 8th. Peck spoke to me for the first time in weeks. He asked how I found Miss Garrett's teaching. I said I found it good. He said she was a fine young woman. He said he hoped the school was providing adequate education for the children in his care. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I know you have always taken a particular interest in the younger children, Cora." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I hope you understand that I have always had the welfare of these children at heart." I said, "Yes, sir." He looked at me for a long time. I looked back. I did not understand what he was trying to tell me, except that he was trying to tell me something. She did not note it in the account then, but she thought about that conversation long after, turning it in her mind, considering its possible meanings. Peck's conversation was almost never without a purpose. He did not make casual remarks. If he was speaking to her about the welfare of the children, He was either making a genuine claim on her sympathy, attempting to recruit her silence through an appeal to shared investment in the institution, or he was warning her. She spent Thursday night in the narrow consideration of both possibilities and arrived by morning at the conclusion that it didn't matter which one it was. The account was in Pack's possession. The arithmetic was being done. Whatever Peck knew or suspected, the mechanism had already been set in motion. Friday, March 9th. Tomorrow is the day. She didn't write more than that. There was nothing more to write that the account was not already holding. George Pack's article appeared in the Saturday edition of the Asheville Citizen on March 10th, 1877. It ran on the front page below the fold, which was not the most prominent position, but was not insignificant. It was headlined in the restrained style of the progressive press of the 1870s as "Irregularities Alleged at County Children's Home. Documentation raises questions about official records and child welfare practices." The headline was careful, legally cautious. The story was not. Pack had done what he promised. He had pulled every quarterly report Peck had filed since 1871 and compared the head counts to the per capita funding requests and found the arithmetic consistent across 6 years. Consistent in the sense that it consistently failed to account for the same order of magnitude of children that Cora's records documented. He had confirmed with 3 separate sources: a delivery driver, a woman who had briefly worked at Burnt Creek as a laundress before being dismissed, and a former resident of the institution who was now a young adult in Asheville. That the conditions described in Cora's account were accurate. He had confirmed through the county assessor's office that Peck held the lease on the Burnt Creek building and was both its lessor and its lessee in his capacity as superintendent. A conflict of interest he had not disclosed in any filing. He had confirmed through the Caulfield Tannery's own payroll records, which were semi-public, that James Hollifield had been in residence at the tannery since March 1876, working 6 days a week with no educational provision noted. He had reproduced sections of Cora's account directly. He had not named her in the article. Pack was careful about this, knowing that the exposure of a 15-year-old still inside the institution would be dangerous before any intervention could protect her. But he had described her as a long-term resident who had maintained, at significant personal risk, a private record of conditions inside the institution, and he had quoted her entries directly, in her own words, in the cramped marginal handwriting that readers could see reproduced in a column alongside the printed text. March 14th, 1876. James was taken today. He cried. Mr. Peck told him to be a man. James is 10. The paper sold out by noon. Pack had sent a copy to Peck on Friday afternoon with the standard professional courtesy of a request for response. Peck had read it and then had done what Peck always did when presented with a situation requiring an immediate decision. He had thought carefully about the mathematics. He had tried to identify who had given Pack the information. He had considered and dismissed several candidates before arriving, with the resignation of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. At the correct conclusion. He had spent Friday night in his dining room with a bottle of apple brandy and the quarterly reports, looking for the arithmetic, errors that would allow him to deny the story, and had found that the arithmetic did not contain the errors he needed. Saturday morning, while the paper was selling out at Pack's circulation office and at the general stores, and at the post office on the square, Peck drove to Burnt Creek from his boarding house in Asheville and called the children into the common room and stood at the front of it in the gray March light and looked at Cora Presley. She stood in the back row and looked back at him. Her face was still, the way her face was always still in his presence. He said nothing to her directly. He gave a brief address to the assembled children about the importance of loyalty and the misfortune of malicious misrepresentation, and the confidence he had that any fair investigation would vindicate the institution's record of care. His voice was steady. He was an accountant, not an orator, and the address had the quality of a document. It was organized and economical, and it committed to nothing that could be directly refuted. When he finished, he looked at Cora once more, and then he turned and left. She watched him go and thought, "He is afraid." She had never seen him afraid before. It was remarkable. He was afraid of the arithmetic and of the names, Thomas Rowe, Pearl Hensley, James Hollifield, and of the fact that a 15-year-old girl had been keeping a record while he had been keeping accounts, and that her record was better than his accounts, and that Pack had printed it, and that there was nothing left to do about any of that now except wait for what came next. What came next arrived in the person of 3 men from the county commissioner's office on the following Monday, sent by Commissioner Avery, who had read the Saturday paper and whose reaction had progressed over the weekend from dismissal to concern, to the particular political anxiety of a man who has countersigned 17 reports he did not read and who is now contemplating the consequences of this habit. The 3 men, 2 clerks and a county attorney, arrived at Burnt Creek with the quarterly reports and spent 4 hours with Peck in his office, and emerged in the late afternoon with expressions that confirmed, to Cora's expert reading, that the arithmetic had indeed been as bad as Pack's article had said. They did not speak to Cora. They did not speak to any of the children. They returned to Asheville and reported to Avery, and Avery sent a letter to the governor's office and to the state superintendent of public education and to the board of the North Carolina Institution for the Education of Children, and the machinery of official response engaged itself with the grinding deliberateness of machinery that has been stationary for a long time and is attempting to move. The process that followed was not the dramatic reckoning that the word justice implies. It was bureaucratic and protracted and incomplete in every way that the bureaucratic response to the exposure of institutional failure tends to be incomplete. Peck was removed from the superintendency in April 1877, 6 weeks after the article ran. Removed, not prosecuted, because the county attorney's review of the applicable statutes found that while Peck had committed fraud in the clearest functional sense, the specific provisions of North Carolina law in 1877 had not been drafted to cover the particular form of fraud he had practiced. The binding out statute, as written, did not require placement fees to be passed to the children. The per capita funding statute, as written, did not explicitly prohibit the collection of private fees for additional children, alongside the public per capita for official ones. The lease arrangement was a conflict of interest that no statute directly prohibited. He was removed for cause and fined a nominal amount and barred from holding any further position administering public funds. He returned to his previous occupation as a clerk and lived in Asheville for another 14 years and died in 1891 without having faced any criminal consequence for the 6 years during which 2 children died in his institution of preventable malnutrition, and dozens more were sold into labor without legal protection. This was the resolution. It was inadequate. It was the resolution available. The orphanage itself was not immediately closed. This was Avery's compromise position, driven, partly, by the same calculation Anna Garrett had made when she first read the account, which was that closure without replacement left 43 children worse off than reform. The county appointed a temporary oversight board that included, at PAC's insistence, one member with direct experience of institutional conditions, Anna Garrett, who was not a natural choice, and who was too young, and who did not have the political connections the committee appointments in Buncombe County in 1877 normally required, but who had, in the weeks after the article ran, conducted herself with such precise and documented competence that her exclusion from any oversight function would itself have been a story PAC could print. The new superintendent, appointed in May 1877, was a man named Alderman, who had run a similar institution in Morganton, and whose record, such as it could be examined, was not fraudulent. He was not inspired. He was not passionate about child welfare in the way that Anna, by that point, had become passionate about it, had become passionate with the particular intensity of someone who has had their naivety converted into conviction through the shock of a specific, proximate, irrefutable set of facts. But he was not Peck, and that was, by the practical metrics of the children at Burnt Creek, an improvement. The food got better, not good. The per capita funding had not been increased because the state legislature was not in session and the county was not going to act on its own. But better. Cornmeal remained the staple, but it was supplemented with more regularity, and the salt that Cora had noted in the account as absent from the mush for months at a stretch was present. The dormitory was inspected and found to require repairs that had not been made in years, and the repairs were made slowly over the summer. The schoolroom was cleaned. Cora watched all of this with the same careful attention she had always paid to the institution's operations, and she documented it in the account. And she felt about it something that she had not felt about Burnt Creek before, which was a cautious and hedged version of something that might eventually become something. Not hope, exactly, not yet, but the structural conditions under which hope was possible. She felt something else, too, which she was less practiced in identifying. She was tired. She had been fighting for 3 years with the specific, drawn-forward energy of someone who has a task that is important enough to override all other needs. The task was done, in the form in which it could be done, and the exhaustion that the task had been holding back was now available to arrive. And it arrived. She was tired in her bones, in the way that 15-year-olds are not usually tired, in the way that people who have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time are tired when they are allowed to set it down. She did not set it down entirely. She kept the account. She kept counting. She kept watching. But the watching was different now. There was someone watching with her, and there was a mechanism that the watching could activate. And the difference between watching alone and watching in the presence of someone who would act was a difference she had not known she needed to feel until she felt it. In July 1877, Anna Garrett asked her if she would consider staying at Burnt Creek in a different capacity. The position was teacher's assistant, a paid position, the first paid position ever offered to a resident of Burnt Creek. A position that did not yet officially exist in any county document, but that Anna had been negotiating into existence through the Oversight Board with the persistent administrative creativity that she had discovered in herself since March. It paid $3 a month, which was not much. It provided Cora with official standing in the institution rather than resident standing, which meant she could not be placed out against her will or dismissed from the building at someone else's discretion. It meant she could keep teaching the younger children, which she had been doing informally for years. It meant she could stay near Eli. Cora sat with this offer for a week before answering. She understood what it was and what it was not. It was not justice. It was not repair. It was not adequate compensation for 7 years of a childhood spent inside a machine that was designed to use children rather than educate them, to extract from them rather than invest in them, to count them as line items in a ledger rather than as human beings with futures. It was a position in a still underfunded, still imperfect institution, in a county where the machinery of child welfare was rudimentary, and the will to improve it was intermittent and political and not to be trusted as a permanent condition. It was also the first time an institution had offered her something rather than taking from it. The first time someone in authority, Anna, imperfect and 24 and still learning, but someone, had looked at what Cora had and said, "We need this. We need you." She accepted. She was 16 years old, and she had already done more with her life than most people twice her age. She went back to the schoolroom, and she taught reading to children who couldn't read yet, which was the most fundamental power she knew how to offer. And she kept the account, and she waited for what would come next. What came next took a long time. History tends to move slowly in the mountains, where the turns of national attention are felt late and leave late, and where the improvements that are announced in the capital take years to appear in the valleys. The Burnt Creek Home for Destitute Children continued to operate under the new superintendent, imperfectly, chronically underfunded, better than before, but not good, for another 22 years. In 1899, the building was condemned and demolished, and the children in residence at the time of demolition were distributed to other facilities, and some to families, and some to the newly established county poorhouse, and some to a new institution in Asheville that had been organized with the assistance of a woman who had been involved in orphanage reform work since the early 1880s and who had, on her desk, a clipping from the March 10th, 1877 edition of the Asheville Citizen. Anna Garrett remained in Buncombe County for the rest of her life. She was active in the North Carolina orphanage reform movement from the 1880s onward, and she testified before the state legislature in 1893 in support of an oversight statute that did not pass, and again in 1897 in support of a modified version that did pass, and that, while inadequate by any standard she would have considered adequate, established at minimum the principle that state-funded institutions caring for children were subject to state inspection at irregular intervals. She never married. She taught until she was 63. When she died in 1934, a brief obituary in the Asheville Citizen noted her role in the reform movement and mentioned, in passing, a case from early in her career involving irregularities at a county children's home, and closed with the observation that she had been, by all accounts, an exceptional teacher. James Hollifield was retrieved from the Caulfield Tannery in the summer of 1877, following Pack's second article on the apprenticeship system, which had run in May, and which had specifically named James and documented his conditions. He was 12 by then. The tannery had done things to his lungs. The bark liquor fumes were not neutral in their effect on the respiratory systems of young children, and James had the beginnings of a cough that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was returned to Burnt Creek under the new superintendent, and was, the following year, placed with a farming family in Henderson County, who had specifically requested a boy with animal experience. They were decent people. James worked their farm and eventually took it over and died on it in 1944 at the age of 78. He never spoke publicly about the tannery. His daughter found his name in Pack's 1877 article when she was researching family history in the 1950s, and she asked him about it once, and he said, "That was a long time ago. Sadie Buchanan stayed with the Doss family. She was legally adopted by them in 1880, when the state legislature clarified the adoption statutes in ways that made such formalization possible and practical. She went to school through the 8th grade and worked the family farm and had 4 children and died in Madison County in 1938. She sent Cora a letter every Christmas until 1920. Eli, whose full name was Elias Jarvis, as was eventually determined from county records in the 1890s, was still at Burnt Creek when Cora became teacher's assistant. He was 6 years old and still largely nonverbal, but had begun in the spring of 1877 to speak in single words and occasionally short phrases in the particular halting way of children who have been silent long enough that language has become a foreign country to which they are making their slow return. The first full sentence Eli ever said to Cora. She was standing in the yard in June of 1877, and he had come to stand beside her in the way he always did, without announcement, appearing at her side as though he had always been there, was, "I found a bird." She looked at him. She said, "Show me." He took her to the east wall of the building where a sparrow had nested in a gap in the foundation stones near the corner. He showed her the nest, very carefully, from a distance that would not disturb the bird. He said, "She has eggs." She said, "Yes." He said, "Will they hatch?" She said, "If we let them alone, they will." He nodded seriously and looked at the nest, and then looked at her with the expression of someone who has asked an important question and received an acceptable answer. He said, "Okay." She wrote about this in the account. She wrote it in the same cramped, angular hand as everything else, in the margin of a piece of wrapping paper from a flower delivery, with the same economy she applied to everything. But she wrote it. It seemed to her like the kind of thing that should be written down, the kind of thing that should be counted among the real events that happened in this place, against the official record that counted other things. June 14th, 1877. Eli showed me a sparrow's nest this morning. He said she has eggs. He asked if they would hatch. I said, if we let them alone, they would. He said, "Okay." He is 6 years old. He is going to be all right. By 1880, Cora had been at Burnt Creek for 11 years, half her life. She was 19 and had been teacher's assistant for 3 years and had watched the institution change slowly in the way that all institutions change slowly under the pressure of insufficient reform. Better, but not good enough. Never good enough by the measure of what the children deserved. She had kept the account. She had continued to document. She had expanded her documentation beyond Burnt Creek into the wider landscape of child welfare in North Carolina, attending public meetings, corresponding with reformers in other counties, following the legislative debates through the newspapers, with the same systematic attention she had once applied to Peck's quarterly reports. She left Burnt Creek in 1882 at 21 to take a teaching position in a school in Asheville proper. She had been recommended for it by Anna Garrett, who had remained her collaborator and her friend, and who had never, in the years of their friendship, stopped learning from her. She taught in Asheville for 15 years. She corresponded with reformers, attended conferences, wrote articles for various progressive publications under her own name, using the account as primary source material when the publication's editors would allow it. They were not always willing. A woman writing under her own name about institutional child abuse in the post-Reconstruction South was not universally welcome in the periodicals of the era. But she was persistent in the way of people who have learned to be persistent through extended practice. In 1897, she married a man named Thomas Catt, a schoolteacher from Watauga County, who had read her articles and sought out a meeting, and who was, by Cora's careful assessment, someone worth trusting, which was not a conclusion she arrived at quickly or easily, but which, once arrived at, proved correct. They had 2 children. She continued to teach and to write and to attend legislative hearings. She was 40 years old in 1901, when the first North Carolina child welfare statute that had any actual enforcement mechanism was passed. She was there for the hearing. She testified. She was 53 in 1914, when the state established a board of public welfare with actual investigative authority over institutions receiving public funds. She was there for that hearing too. She was known by then in the circles where child welfare legislation was debated and shaped as a woman whose specific authority came from a specific source, the account which she had carried with her from Burnt Creek, which she still had, the same pages in the same cramped handwriting on the same scraps of newspaper margin and supply crate paper, yellowing now but legible, the record of what a child had seen and refused to let be unseen. She was 59 years old in 1920, and the North Carolina General Assembly was considering a bill, House Bill 247, the Child Welfare Protection Act, that would establish mandatory regular inspections of all children's institutions in the state, create enforceable standards for nutrition, housing, and education, prohibit the binding out of children under 14, and require that any private fees collected in connection with child placements be paid to the child upon their majority. It was a good bill. It was not a perfect bill. No bill is. But it was specific and enforceable, and it had sufficient legislative support to pass if the hearing went well. Cora had been asked to testify. She sat before the General Assembly in January of 1920 with the account on the table in front of her, the pages that were now 44 years old, and she thought about what to say and how to say it. She was a composed woman by 59. She had always been composed. Composure was one of the first things she had learned at Burnt Creek, the composure of someone who cannot afford to let what she feels be visible to the people who would use it against her. But now, the composure was of a different kind. It was the composure of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to protect, except the facts. She was not afraid of this room, or these men, or their political calculations. She had been in rooms full of political calculations since she was 15 years old, and she knew what they were and how they moved, and where their soft places were. She had thought, sitting down, about which entry to read. She had many entries she could have read. Entries that documented the food budget in mathematical detail. Entries that named the children sent out and cataloged their conditions as best she had been able to determine them. Entries that described the deaths of Thomas Rowe and Pearl Hensley with the same precise economy she had applied to everything. Any of these would have served. But she chose the one she always came back to, the one she had carried in her mind since March of 1876, because it was the shortest and because it contained everything. She said, "I have been keeping this record since I was 14 years old. I began keeping it because I was afraid that if I did not, the things I was seeing would simply not exist, that they would happen, and nobody outside would know they happened, because nobody outside was looking. I kept it through 2 failed attempts to get it to someone who could act on it, through years, when I had no reason to believe anyone would ever read it, through the years after it was used and published, and contributed to the removal of one superintendent and the partial reform of one institution. I kept it because the things in it are true, and because I believe that true things, even the worst true things, deserve to be recorded." She paused. She said, "I want to read you one entry. It is not the most detailed entry. It is not the entry with the most specific evidence. It is 17 words." She found the entry. It was on the 4th page, in the middle of a page, in handwriting that was smaller and more cramped than the writing around it, because she had been running out of space. She read it. March 14th, 1876. James was taken today. He cried. Mr. Peck told him to be a man. James is 10. She looked up. She said, "James Hollifield is alive. He is 54 years old. He farms in Henderson County. He has grandchildren. He does not need this bill to pass." He got out. But there are children today in institutions in this state who are the same age James was when this entry was written, and they are eating what James ate and sleeping where James slept. And the quarterly reports filed about them contain the same arithmetic that the quarterly reports filed about James contained. Accurate in what they state, and completely misleading about what they omit. The bill before you today would change that. The inspection requirements and the nutritional standards and the prohibition on binding out children under 14. These provisions would have protected James in 1876. They will protect children today. I am asking you to pass this bill. She sat down. The General Assembly of North Carolina passed House Bill 247 on February 3rd, 1920. The vote was 67 to 29 in the House and 31 to 12 in the Senate. Governor Thomas Bickett signed it into law on February 12th, 1920. The Burnt Creek home for destitute children was demolished in 1899. The site was cleared, and the creek ran past it the way it always had, rust red from the iron ore in the banks, and the valley filled in the decades that followed with the regular growth of the mountains, second growth forest and pasture, and the particular silence of a place where something happened that is no longer marked. No historical marker stands on the site. Cora Presley Catt died in 1941 at the age of 80 in Asheville, North Carolina. She was survived by her husband, Thomas, who died the following year, and by her 2 children, and by 6 grandchildren, and by the account, which she had given to the North Carolina State Archives in 1935, in a ceremony that was not a ceremony. She had simply brought it to the archivist's office in a brown envelope and set it on the desk and explained what it was and asked that it be preserved. The account is held in the North Carolina State Archives, cataloged under Miscellaneous Children's Welfare Documents. Box 14, Folder 7. The catalog entry reads, Presley, Cora, Private Record of Conditions, Burnt Creek Home for Destitute Children, Buncombe County, North Carolina, 1874 to 1877. Handwritten on newspaper and paper scraps. 31 pages. Donated 1935. It has been checked out 11 times in 120 years. The last person to check it out was a graduate student in history at the University of North Carolina, working on a dissertation about child welfare reform in the post-Reconstruction South. She requested it through the archive's reading room procedures and was handed it across a table by a curator wearing cotton gloves, because paper of that age requires cotton gloves and careful handling. She read through it in a single afternoon. She noted the cramped, angular handwriting. Practical, not ornamental. The handwriting of someone who learned to write without being taught, and whose writing therefore had only the purpose of writing and none of its social performance. She noted the careful brevity of the entries. She noted the specific, precise particulars, the names, the dates, the numbers that could be checked against the official record. She noted the places where the tone shifted. Barely, just enough. The entry about Eli and the sparrow, written in the same hand, but with something in the compression of the words that was different from the accounting-style entries around it. She was 28 years old, which was younger than Cora had been when she testified before the legislature, and older than Cora had been when she started the account. She sat with it for a while after she was done reading. The archivist, coming back to check on her, found her sitting with her hands flat on the table on either side of the folder, looking at the last page, which was blank. The back of the last page of writing, white and empty. The end of what Cora had needed to record, and the beginning of everything that came after. The archivist said, "Are you finished?" She said, "Yes, thank you." She sat for another moment. She said, "How many people have looked at this?" The archivist checked the checkout log. He said, "You're the 11th. She said, "In how long?" He said, "The donation was in 1935, so 85 years." She was quiet for a moment. She said, 11 people in 85 years. He said, "Yes." She said, "She kept it for 60 years before she gave it away." He said, "Yes." She looked at the last page again. Then she closed the folder and handed it back and said, "Please take good care of it." He said, "We do." She picked up her notes and her bag and walked out into the afternoon, into a city that had been built on and around, and in spite of the history that documents like this one recorded. And she thought about Cora Presley, at 14, with a stolen pencil and a scrap of newspaper margin, writing in the dark, knowing that no one was coming to save the children in that building except the record she was making. She thought, it should have been read more than 11 times. She walked to her car and drove back to Chapel Hill and sat down at her desk and opened her dissertation and began to write. She began with the quarterly report. She began with the numbers. She began with what they didn't say.